Hello, I'm Julie Poppy along with Stephanie Clothier with the Early Care and Education Project, and thank you to everyone for being on today's webinar, Opportunities to Partner with the Private Sector in Early Learning, the last of 4 webinars for the Early Learning Fellows. We know that some of you are here on the call today in audio only, and we are so glad that you're able to make it. You know, before we begin, I just want to mention a few things, and the first being, we've seen some of the fellows in person recently, which has been just great. We had a few fellows attend the home visiting meeting in Hartford, Connecticut. Representative Merrill, Representative Belcher, Baining, Representative Myra, and Senator James. And so that was great to see you all. And then just this week, we saw a few fellows at our legislative meeting in Chicago, Representative Belcher, Assemblywoman Luke, Representative Guile, Representative Kirkman, and a few of the legislative staff who are fellows as well. So that it's just been wonderful to see you guys over the summer. In a few moments, Stephanie will walk through the agenda and mention the goals of today's webinar. But I wanted to mention a few words about the flow of the year and what we've covered in these webinars. You know, we took your input and we've learned about best practices, the science behind early learning, professional development, and teacher quality on children's outcomes. So we hope you've enjoyed these topics and you've learned something new. I'm also going to mention here NCSL resources again. You know, we're always available to help you. You know, you can access the Early Childhood Legislative Database where you can search early childhood bills, enacted legislation, and we can always help any of you with any legislation ideas that you have or research topics. So please just remember us. So with this webinar, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, as our host said, either through your computer or by phone. So I'd like to ask the webinar operator to come back on the line, just because I know that we've had a few people getting on, and just repeat the instructions on how to do that. Omar?
Okay. What you can do is simply type your message to the box, click in the lower right-hand side of your screen, and message in the box to click on the send button.
Thank you. Okay, so before I hand it over to Stephanie, I'd like to introduce our speakers, which you will now see on your webinar screen. You know, for those of you listening to the audio part only, these bios, plus the presentations, are available on the Fellows website. Just go down to the webinar listed and click there, and you'll see all the bios and presentations. You can also email Allison at allison.may@ncsl.org, and she'll get them to you. So we're really excited to have our presenters with us today. I'm just going to briefly mention a few items here about them. So our first presenter is Mike Pedro, who's Acting Director for the Committee for Economic Development. He's worked for nearly 15 years at CED and has extensive policy interactions with numerous private sector leaders in the U.S. and around the world. And our second presenter is Doug Price, President and CEO of Rocky Mountain PBS and a board member of Colorado's EPIC, which stands for Executives Partnering to Invest in Children. He has many years of experience in banking and has thought much about how the private sector can help ensure children develop into healthy and productive citizens. So with that, I'm going to turn everything over to Stephanie.
Great, thanks, Julie. So I was just going to make a couple of comments to kick us off today in our webinar. And as Julie mentioned, you know, this is the 4th seminar that we are holding for our Early Learning Fellows. And for this one, we really wanted to sort of venture into a new realm, to think about potential partners in early learning that legislators and legislatures can think about. We've covered a number of policy topics over the course of the year, many of them sort of more detailed in the weeds topics, whether it's professional development or different kinds of best practices and legislation that you all could consider. For this one, we really wanted to try to have a conversation with members of the private sector to explore ways that legislators have or could partner together on these issues. And it's very clear to us as we look around both at legislation and at state budgets that, you know, it's been a very tough several years in terms of state budgets and revenues. And we know that as state lawmakers sort of emerge from this budget crisis, that there are going to be a lot of decisions to make about new investments and new policy areas to explore. And early learning can be one of those, but we know it'll be a very tough challenge to find new revenue for these kinds of programs as well as others. So what we thought would be interesting to you all is to really think about how you might partner with the private sector. And primarily for this conversation, we're really going to be talking about business leaders, but we also think of the private sector as philanthropy as well. In terms of background, and I know both of our speakers are really going to give you a little bit of history of the private sector engagement in these issues, but I wanted to just say a couple of words about it, because over the years we've really seen a number of different ways that the private sector has gotten involved in early learning, and those include a real range of potential activities. One is they have funded major efforts, and I think back, and probably both Doug and Mike can remember back to the Bank of America $50 million commitment and their partnership with United Way Success by 6, which was really one of the first opportunities that we saw for the private sector to launch a set of efforts across the country. They haven't all been that large or that expansive across the country, but we've also seen a number of state efforts and state partnerships where the private sector has made new investments or come to the table as a voice of the business community, whether it's on an early childhood commission or a council or something like that. There are also a variety of business leader organizations that have taken on early learning as a portion of the kinds of issues they work on. And there's also been a number of private philanthropy efforts that have made it possible to do things that the legislature just could not appropriate funding to, and whether that was, for example, an early learning evaluation or an evaluation of an intervention or some type of quality initiative that complemented the direction the state was already going. So we've seen some really great efforts from the private sector. And I think the interesting thing here that we are wanting to explore with our speakers is both those kinds of efforts and some new thinking around, how could the private sector that has real strong interest in early learning connect to legislators to get some new initiatives off the ground. We think of things like new pilot programs or new quality efforts or other kinds of endowments or initiatives or institute kinds of things. And, I think we see a number of potential opportunities out there. For this webinar, what we're expecting you to hear about really is a few things. One is business leader recommendations around early learning, and you're going to hear that from Mike Pedro from CED. We also expect you to hear about how legislators and the private sector can partner, and you're going to hear from a number of efforts, both across the country and from Doug about efforts in Colorado. And then you'll hear some specific examples of the leadership opportunities from both speakers. After both of them have spoken, we're going to have some discussion. I'm going to lead off with a couple of questions, and I also encourage both Doug and Mike to comment or communicate with each other if you have comments to follow up with each other or want to make a remark in response to something the other one has said, because I think the more flowing and interesting the conversation can be, the better. So I think from now, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Pedro to kick us off for today. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Steph and Julie and my friends at the NCSL. Right now I'm looking at the website of the NCSL, and I don't have my slides in front of me. So if that's a glitch, I might just continue with this presentation and hope for the best. What do you think?
Hold on, Mike, hold on one second. So when you, are you still on the original Infinite site that you were on before where you could see
We haven't touched anything. Now we're just sort of on the website. At some point it just clicked.
Okay, well, we will check on that. If you're comfortable beginning your presentation, I think I can follow you in terms of the slides, but we'll check on that right away.
All righty, thank you. So thanks to everybody, and thanks for the fellows and for the folks that are listening here today. Today, what I'd like to do is give you a national business perspective on business attitudes around early learning and early education. What I'd like to do is start off by describing my organization, the Committee for Economic Development, briefly summarize why business, and CED in particular, is engaged in early childhood issues. I'd like to highlight newly released study, Unfinished Business, and give some examples of business leadership that's currently taking place across the country to address early learning needs. And I'd like to close with a slide that just briefly talks about how to engage business leaders when you're out in the field and you're talking to corporate leaders. But first, and then I'd ask Steph if you could change the slide. First, a little bit about CED. CED is a Washington-based public policy organization. We're comprised of over 200 senior corporate executives. Some of the nation's largest companies are represented in CED, and some university presidents. We are the organization that brought you the Marshall Plan. CED's roots can be traced in the 1940s when a group of CEOs came together to help the nation make an orderly transition from a wartime to peacetime economy. And one of CED's first policy studies actually became the inspiration or the blueprint for the Marshall Plan. In fact, CED's first chairman, Paul Hoffman, who was the CEO of Studebaker, was also the first administrator of the Marshall Plan. So CED's business leaders form subcommittees or task forces around various domestic and foreign policy issues and provide a much-needed business perspective. Our recommendations often reflect what's good for society and the overall economy, and not simply what's just good for business. Next slide. Now, CED has been involved in early education issues because our members see themselves as the beneficiaries of the system and because they have an acute understanding of the importance of a well-educated workforce to support the economy and keep America competitive globally. If a community's talent pool is weak, economic development staggers, and business suffers. Currently, 20% of the American workforce is either functionally or illiterate or innumerate. Now, investing in high-quality child care and early education builds a strong foundation of cognitive and social skills in young children that can improve their engagement in school. And it can also increase per capita earnings and economic development. Now, we all know that investments in human capital breeds economic success, not only for those being cared for and educated, but also for the overall economy. It's no mystery that the most successful economies are those with the most educated workers. And as advances in global transportation and communications shrink the planet, worldwide competition will continue to intensify. And as we move from an industrial to a knowledge-based economy, our ability to remain competitive globally will depend on the quality of that human capital. Next slide. CED trustees have been concerned about the so-called achievement gap in America, which has been likened to the economic equivalent of a permanent recession in America. In America today, more children are growing up in poverty than at any time since 1962, which puts them at risk for development and dropping out of school. The repercussions are felt throughout society. For example, in terms of lost earnings and tax revenue, increased health costs, and population unfit for employment and productive work. You know, we at CED travel around the country, and we talk to business leaders and others about this issue. But one group that's out there is a group called Mission Readiness. It's made up of retired admirals and retired generals. And I was at an event in Jackson, Mississippi, and I had this retired general, and he got up in front of an audience, and he said that 75% of young people, ages 17 to 24, were physically unfit to become members of the military. So this is a national security issue. So healthcare as well as education, I think, is something to keep in mind. Next slide. This past June, CED trustees released Unfinished Business, a study directed at public and private sector leaders, urging them to support increased investments in children from birth to third grade. Now, the report begins by chronicling several decades of business involvement in early childhood education, beginning with Brad Butler, CEO of Procter & Gamble, and Jim Rainier, the CEO of Honeywell and founder of Success by 6. These two leaders use their positions as CEOs to advance the cause of early childhood policies around the country. The report calls on this generation of business leaders to provide leadership by becoming business champions in support of early learning policy. Now, leadership exhibited by many corporate leaders who are using their resources, time, and energy to support early learning. Now, this report is groundbreaking in many respects, and I want you to listen to these 4 recommendations because I think you'll agree with me that they resonate. First, investments in early learning is an economic imperative. CED views investments in young children as a key strategy toward future economic growth. We're not just saying in this report unfinished business. We're not just talking about the fact that this is a good thing for the economy. We're actually talking about the fact that this could be a tool, that investments in early learning can be a tool to improve the economy. Now, second, CED has a history of being a budget hawk organization. We supported a version of the Simpson-Bowles Commission recommendations, the idea of having budget cuts and tax reforms on the table to bring some fiscal restraint to our national budget. But CED says balance the budget, but do not balance the budget on the backs of children. The CED report says that fiscal prudence should not come at the expense of early learning programs for young children. Next slide. The other thing that this report says is that business needs to put a little skin in the game by contributing 1% of corporate profits to public-private partnerships. This is a very significant recommendation, one that as you can imagine, our business members talked about for quite a while. But I think the consensus of this committee was that if we're going to ask legislators to make some bold moves, business leaders ought to stand with them and be bold as well. So that recommendation of 1% of corporate profits, we think is an important recommendation. And then the fourth, what I think is another significant finding, is that underinvestment in children undermines our country's standing in the world from a global competitiveness standpoint. On this last point, the U.S. lags behind many highly developed countries in formulating a coherent national strategy to promote early learning and development for all children and making the connection to the future economy. In fact, compared to other developed nations in the OECD, the U.S. spends a smaller percentage of GDP on children birth to 5. This point is of particular concern to business as they compete in the global marketplace. Now, the report, in addition to the above recommendations, the report urges business to use their influence to keep early childhood at the forefront of all decisions at the community, state, and national levels, and it asks elected officials to support increased investment in early childhood. It also voices support of the above agenda among peers at public events. It asks business leaders to create business champions from their own contacts in the business community. And it asks business leaders to make their companies' policies more family-friendly and educate employees about the importance of early childhood issues. Next slide. Now what I'd like to do is give you just a few examples of what's going on around the country, examples of business leadership, because we know that if these programs are to grow and sustain themselves over a period of time, it's going to take leadership, not just from public policy leaders, but from the business community as well. One example is started by Netscape founder Jim Barksdale. He helped create Mississippi Building Blocks, Mississippi Building Blocks research initiative designed to serve as a model for how Mississippi can work within existing child care centers to improve children's early learning and school readiness. Corporate support has helped raise $7 million over the last 7 years to enable Mississippi Building Blocks to help child care and early education programs serving low-income children to improve their quality rating systems and to evaluate their results. I would argue that in Mississippi, you have an engaged business community, business leaders who see that they've got many, many challenges across the state, and they recognize that they need to support early learning programs. In North Carolina, leaders have established the innovative Start Smart public-private partnership in 1993 to improve school readiness through 3 major strategies: improving access to high-quality child care and an early education, providing parents tools to help them raise healthy, happy, and successful children, and ensuring access to preventative health care. Locally run Smart Start partnerships for children made up public and private organizations grew in all 100 North Carolina counties. The percentage of children attending high-quality child care more than doubled. And this is very, very significant. And finally, I wanted to point out another business leader out there by the name of Jim Rohr, who runs a bank called Pnc Financial. The bank originally headquartered in Pittsburgh, but it's grown down south and to the Midwest. And what they have created is an organization called Grow Up Great, help children prepare for school, and it helps with school readiness. PNC plans to provide $250 million over 10 years to continue supporting families, educators, and community partners through Grow Up Great. Jim Rohr is another one of those business champions that we talked about. Next slide, please. Finally, I'd like to end by talking to you about ways that you can engage the business community and ways that you can get their attention. The thing we have to remember is that business leaders are very busy, and that early childhood education is not something that they wake up and think about first thing in the morning. So it's very, very important when you're engaging with them that you strike certain messages that might resonate with them. And the first that I would say is a lot of it is about talent. You know, the leaders that I talked about earlier in my presentation, Jim Bernier and Brad Butler, one of the reasons why they got involved in early education is that they were concerned about the talent and skills of the young people coming out of high school and the colleges. And when they examined the system, they realized that it was really at the very early years that they needed to concentrate their efforts. And so when you're talking to business leaders throughout the country are very concerned about the talent, the skills gap, and about talent. And so this is a way, in talking to them and engaging with them, that you can get their attention. Next, I would argue that the new research, especially the economic research that was conducted by Jim Heckman some 5 to 7 years ago, and the research that's been done by Jack Shonkoff out of Harvard on science and on the brain, that's had a very significant impact on business leaders. You know, prior to that economic research, the business leaders who traditionally got involved in early education did it because it was, in their view, the right thing to do. But since the research and the marvelous work, especially done by Shonkoff and Heck, business leaders have seen this as an economic imperative, as I mentioned earlier. And so what I would argue is that when you talk about this in kind of flowery terms, you're only going to get a certain level of support from business. But when you talk about it as economic issue, business leaders pay attention, and that is a way to get them to support some of the programs. And finally, I would end by saying that you know, these programs have economic implications for 10, 20, 30 years down the road. They have economic implications for our society as a whole. But I would argue that they affect the economy right now. And, you know, I like to point to 2000 American Business Collaborative report, where 63% of the employees reported improved productivity while using quality attendant care, and that there's a correlation between breakdowns in the child care system and tardiness, absenteeism, and reduced concentration at work. And finally, child care breakdowns leading to absences cost companies in excess of $3 billion annually. And you know, if you don't think that this is a part of the economy right now, you're kidding yourself. It is. It affects how workers approach their job. When mothers and fathers come to work and they are concerned about their child, in what kind of system they might be, it affects their work and affects the product of the firm. So I apologize in advance for maybe the mix-up with the slides. So I hope, Steph, you've been able to kind of keep me honest here, but it's been a little tricky without having this in front of me. But I'm happy to continue the conversation with everybody. And again, I'm pleased to have been part of this discussion and look forward to continued dialogue for the rest of the afternoon with everyone.
Thanks, Mike. Your slides went right through just fine, so I'm not sure why you couldn't see them, but I think we all could. So
okay,
we're good to go.
Excellent.
So this is Julie here, and before I hand it off to Doug Price, I just wanted to mention that we do have a copy available of Unfinished Business, CED's report. It's available on NCSL's website, ncsl.org/fellows. You'll be able to find it right there in the webinar section under resources. So, so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Doug Price.
It's great to be with everybody today. Let me sort of preface my comments by giving you some context about me biographically, and I think that what I want to make sure that who I'm talking to today are Representative Myra, Senator James, Patsy Pierce, Sarah Archibald. I think that you have very specific needs with what you have to do moving forward, and I think this context is important. Both at PBS and in early childhood, I would charitably describe myself as center-right. I think Julie, Poppy, and Stephanie might have me further to the right than center-right. The reason I say that's important is I think you can make an inordinately strong conservative argument. For those of you who are activists on behalf of children, I think you have to get as broad a constituency as you can to create change. And so from my perspective, I will tell you that when I was appointed to be the chairman of the Business Commission on Child Care Financing early on in the mid-1990s, I was a bank president. I had a stay-at-home wife. I had 2 kids that had never seen a child care setting. And the staffer to Governor Romer, who saw it wasn't an application, they were recruiting me, she said not only was I not qualified, but that I was the antichrist of child care. So it's important to know that there's a lot of voices and a lot of directions out there. But the presentation and I'll go to the next slide, that Mike talked about really was from a group of people who are rationalists. And by that, I mean use education to try to create a perspective that lets progress occur. When I think about these issues, I'll start by this comment that nostalgia is the enemy, but history is the guide. The tendency for somebody like me, if you notice, most businesses in America are run still by middle-aged, middle-class white men. And most of us were born, I'm old now. I used to say this when I was in my 30s, now I'm 55. We were born into an era where fewer than 14% of women were in the workforce. So 8 out of 9 kids were staying home, generally speaking, with the parent. And many of the systems that we have are designed for our own childhoods, not for the time of our children today. And I think that is the starting point I make, is that left or right, conservative or not, that you have to understand the environment in which your kids are living. And it's not the neighborhood you grew up in 1955, in my case, or even in 1970. It's radically changed. 70% of women are in the workforce, and this is true in Utah as well as it is in North Carolina or as it is in Georgia. So the driver for the need to act, for political will, revolves around the needs of children to be competitive. So one of the things we do with EPIC, as was described earlier, our mission is to harness the political and financial capital of the business sector to ensure that children develop into healthy, educated, and highly important, productive citizens. I want to note right away that when you think about what you do, business is not a funding stream that's going to solve a legislator's problem with respect to the need to invest in young children. At this point in time, roughly speaking, 75 to 80% of the funding, 72 to 80% of the funding for any state's child care system is coming from parents. Roughly speaking, 24% is coming from government, and roughly speaking, 1% is coming from business and philanthropy. So when you think about these big investments, they're huge dollars, but child care in America is just right at $10 billion a year, and philanthropic investment is not coming close to approximating 1% of that. So you have to appreciate that, unfortunately, as much as you may want to delegate this responsibility to others, it's on your shoulders as legislators and statewide policy. So given that issue, you want to begin to think about how you ally yourself with business interests in order to make a rational argument for what you want to do. I start out by saying that investments shouldn't be made unless you have an expected outcome for them. We talked a little bit about that. So governance structures that evolve should be designed to make sure the outcome happens. It is certainly clear that James Heckman pointed out that the best returns on capital of governmental investment are in the youngest children. That's when the brain development is occurring. That's when the widest impact is made. And that's when you have the opportunity to create the most impact. So begin by thinking about how you would invert the investment from the later stages of high school or college to a younger age in order to really think about maximizing outcomes at school. The government structure should be created to do that. One of the things on the state level, and that's what NCSL, you guys are the actors by and large, but most funding streams in early childhood are flowing from the federal government. And those funding streams still tend to be siloed and categorized. So as you think about the creation of your government structures, businesses do this really well. They organize around the money. So what I say is follow the money, follow the outcome. So as you organize what you want to do, have a clear appreciation of the desired goal of your governance system to create students who are ready to learn as they hit kindergarten. With respect to implementing strategies, again, we use the rating system, and I think that that's one of the things that was a product of the CED relationship I had with Brad Butler. We raised $30 million in Colorado to create this system that really looked at Qualistar early learning, and you can look at Qualistar if you choose to on the website qualistar.org. But Qualistar is the first ratings movement in America, basically. It has, we share a patent on the intellectual property, but it broke down early childhood implementing strategies into the four really key areas. Learning environment, family partnership, again, the relationship between the caregiver and the parent is essential. Parents are the prime drivers. Training and education, adult-to-child ratio and group size, and finally the concept of accreditation. The accreditation, candidly, was because we didn't want to fight any political battles with existing accreditation groups. But at the time we started in 95 through 97, there really were no great rating systems or great accreditation systems moving forward. They were pretty aspirational what they wanted to do. So this system now is in 40-some states, 46 states. I would wager to bet those of you, I think somebody's from Kansas in here, at least I've seen some names in Kansas that were part of this group, and they helped us work on that together in the greater Kansas City area. Think about what you want to do. About every rating system in the country has been designed around at least 3 of these 5 elements, and the reason for that is simple. the statistical abstracts we use, which is a fancy way of saying we took every study that was existent in 1995, looked at those items in the statistical abstracts that had the highest coefficients of correlation to outcome for children. So when you start thinking about learning environment, family partnership, training and education, ratios and group size, those are the things that matter to kids, and that's why they're in the rating system. And anything you do to enhance and improve those that doesn't negatively impact finance is the way you should focus your attention. So I go back to that business case for early childhood education support. Again, the next slide. Let's see, you got that. I always talk about the idea that progress is made at the intersection of selfishness and altruism. Mike talked about the do-gooder impulse, and people knew. I don't think people do good just because it feels good. I think there's an intrinsic belief that you'll change the outcome. I think that there is also a selfish issue for us that we want to make sure our kids are well taken care of, that things happen. And so investing in the well-being of the youngest kids will ensure capable workers. Well, that's a selfish goal. I really always want to fund my Social Security by knowing who's going to be at the core of their earning years when they graduate from high school. So I sort of work my way back to know who I really need to focus attention on. It used to be somebody who was just born, and now at my age I have to focus attention on somebody who's in 6th grade. Again, I think that as you consider the policy implications, when you invest matters. Invest early. Then invest in a way that you know how you're designing it. I think it's true in K through 12, but what we're finding more and more is that there's 3 components to what happens in early childhood that can never be replaced that are essential. There's literacy or pre-literacy, numeracy or pre-numeracy, and that socialization impact. And so if you look at the countries who have made great progress in higher education, we in the past 12 years have gone from being #1 in the world in the production per capita of baccalaureate degrees to number 17. There's a reason for that. The countries in the OECD who have eclipsed us all have excellent early childhood systems, all have diligent public policy directives that lead to changed outcomes, and particularly lead to changed outcomes in the sense of producing more technological degrees. So if you think about what you're creating an anti-competitive environment if you fail to invest in those 3 elements, pre-literacy, pre-numeracy, and socialization over time. We have a tendency to think it's the family's responsibility. Those of us who are relatively conservative, I think, traditionalists, we can think it's the family's responsibility all we want, but it doesn't change the patterns of employment. It doesn't change the quality of the settings that exist, and it surely doesn't change the outcomes for kids. You have to be, whether conservative or liberal, you have to think about what do you want for children's success, what things are present in your state that will lead to that, what gaps exist that have to be addressed, and understand with respect to the financing stream, it's a partnership between parent and government that leads to that, and the business community is best purposed to help you and execute a political strategy, a public will strategy that leads to your ability to be impactful in your own legislative body. Let me talk a little bit about what EPIC is. It's a group of people, and interestingly married to the child advocacy organizations in the state. So on one side of the ledger, you have an executive committee that's formed of the United Way, of the Colorado Children's Campaign, the public, the community foundation movement. So people who are actually existing funders, who are actually immersed day to day in dealing with the problems of early childhood. And then on the other side of the ledger is a group of executives that I partner with, people like Dan Ritchie, who was formerly the CEO of Westinghouse, Pat Hamill, David Mirage, did Hot Pockets and has a big, made a bunch of money selling Hot Pockets. And when they sold the company, had hundreds of millions of dollars and put a substantial amount of that towards early childhood activities because he just believed it was the right thing to do. So the idea there is that we study and understand the needs of children on a nonpartisan or practically bipartisan basis. About 2/3 of our group tend to be Republicans or relatively conservative folks. About 1/3 of the business executives are ostensibly Democrats or progressive. I don't know the blend of the executive committee, but the goal is to make sure that we converse, understand, and then act. And the ultimate big idea is to make Colorado the best place to raise a child and to be #1 in child outcomes and school readiness as we move forward. Again, the incredible returns on investment, I don't think we have to talk about that. So that's an example, really, of what you think about in terms of, I wouldn't call it lobbying, but a public will-building entity that ultimately can help you raise funding. One example, and Stephanie, do you want to talk about the Children's Corridor real quick, and then we can open it for questions?
Doug, I was thinking that you would want to finish up, or I know some about it as well.
Let me walk through the Children's Corridor, because I think it, too, is an example of a highly focused project. Terry Minger, who's the president of the Pnc Foundation, worked with Sam Gary, who is the funder of the Pnc Foundation. Sam is a wonderful friend. I think, Mike, you know Sam as well. Sam's about 86. Terry Minger is on my board, has a history in city planning, has been a philanthropist and a foundation president for a long time. But what they decided they would do, and this is the difference between piloting and bringing things to scale. Business is great at piloting. We piloted the ratings movement in America in Colorado, and I noticed that almost every state that's a part of this has a rating system that is represented in the class of fellows has a rating system. That rating system is a byproduct of North Carolina, Colorado, and Oklahoma working together to think about changing the way things happen. It was a pilot project that we had $30 million in local funding, and at this point in time, $500 million of the Early Learning Challenge Grant was really organized around the essential DNA of quality ratings. There's about $2.5 to $3 billion in annual funding on statewide, local levels, other places, Denver Preschool Program being an example, Aspen being an example, that use quality rating systems as the accountability structure for their investment in early childhood. That idea that you have a more predictable outcome because of what you do. So that was an example of a pilot program that, when it scaled, was done at the legislative level. And when Qualistar itself was adopted for certain things, it passed the state legislature unanimously in the most purple of states. At a time when you had a lot of people that could have politicized the issue of children, when they asked this to be adopted, it was passed unanimously. This was before this was under Bill Owens, who was the Republican governor of the state, and both houses at the time, I believe, Republican. So you can see that there's a great constituency for public-private partnership in early childhood, irrespective of the political tone that's set. I think, Sarah Archibald, when I look at Wisconsin, this is a great place for you to consider working with your business community to create some unity in a state that has become divided and factionalized for whatever reason. The Children's Corridor is a great example of Terry Minger, the Pnc Foundation, Sam Gary saying, we wanted to take a geographically based perspective. If you go, let's go to the last page, I think, to give you a sense of what they did. Really, and then we'll back up. But if you look at this map, there's 35,450 vulnerable children in the corridor. In Colorado, we have about a 20% child poverty rate, which is inordinately high, and the highest concentration of children in poverty is in these neighborhoods. So there was a decision made to focus attention, to focus both health care, child care, and other resources in a specific way that allowed those children to move forward. The goals, if we could then go back to if we go back, you can start seeing what we have. How's that for really? 41 square miles, 14 neighborhoods. Again, the number of languages, 54,000 children. So you see that 38,000 of the 54,000 are at risk. The goal, again, and I think this is the goal for all of us, is to be kindergarten ready. We already know from Jim Heckman's work that the essential thing is to be kindergarten ready. If you're kindergarten ready, that means the idea of graduating from high school, being competitive for a seat in college and in career is really important. So that idea of those objectives, kindergarten ready, graduate from high school, have a medical, those three things were the essential elements that they wanted to move to choose moving forward. They've been remarkably successful in the early phases of getting that accomplished. Now, of course, the graduation from high school is a distance away, but with the recent reform in healthcare, the idea of a medical home and access to that is much improved. The idea of being able to register is much improved. And some of the settings that have been rated in the early childhood arena to make children kindergarten ready have been incredibly improved. Some of the improvement, I'd say the majority of the improvement comes from a more diligent application of the existing resources. But I think my concluding comment is that as much as we would like to hope, hope is not a strategy. That the reality remains that the distance between a high-quality early childhood education and the one that is delivered today is unfortunately correlated to money invested. So there's a lot that we can do to create change. My original reason for entering this field as a conservative bank president was this idea that I could re-engineer the field to create a far more efficient and less costly alternative. The reality was that is simply not possible, that you have to accept that this is an underfunded domain. It's largely parents who are responsible to create the funding stream that supports it, and in the long run, the economic consequences of failure are much greater here than they are in any other segment of the educational or employment preparation system. And with that, I'll turn it back to Julie and to Stephanie.
Doug, thanks. That was terrific. So now we're going to open it up to questions. And I think you have heard the instructions about using your chat box to write a question. I'm going to actually probably kick us off with a question, and then I think I'll have the operator remind us how to do an audio question, because we have a number of people, I think, on the phone, too. So, we got some questions coming in. But I'm going to kick it off first, and then we'll see if we can get some questions in. So I'm going to ask actually a question of both of you, and then you can feel free to answer, and then also to ask each other or comment around the other's presentation or remarks. So I'm going to start with Mike. So I was going to build off your talent slide, and I know you were thinking of talent in a different way in terms of the business leader interest in getting good talent. But I was thinking about it, and I also, of course, think of, Doug, your leadership in this field. But I'm interested in what the private sector, what the public sector should be asking of the private sector. And you've both raised a number of examples, but I was curious about whether you see any new opportunities. The Children's Corridor you named already. Qualistar is a very clear example of the business sector taking an idea, having the idea, and leading. But I wonder if you see anything else in terms of what the public sector could be asking of business leaders. Mike, do you want to take it first, and then Doug?
Well, first off, I think it's very important when you approach business leaders that you have an ask that is tangible and that it's doable and something that they can complete. I think what happens oftentimes is the individual from the business community voices his or her support for this issue, and then people come out of the woodwork asking them to do this and do that. And I think what's really, really important is so the ask is manageable, okay? And I think the most important thing is it continues to be around being a public face in support of this issue and using what I call their clout. Using their clout in the sense that they can pick up the phone and they can talk to the governor or talk to legislators. So I would keep the ask simple, and I would keep the ask around this kind of public space that you can provide for this this effort. Again, when you hear people talk about this issue, when it's a business leader who stands up and represents this issue, people do pay attention, and I think that's critically important.
I love Mike Pedro. He's my guy, but I'm going to disagree with him. Or I'm going to agree with him, but I'm going to expand on what he said. When you're dealing with business leadership, don't ask them for small goals. I think manageable is different, and I think Mike would say that, and he can correct me. But business executives want audacity. I don't want to invest my time. I was with the EPIC board last night, and there were some complaints that we didn't have, a current project that had impact. And it's like, hey, if you don't have a current project that has impact, I got better things to do. And I think that is an essential thing, is that you must ask for something that is big, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And that's what gets people excited, not small incremental change, not go talk in general terms about what the good of early childhood is, but be very specific in the ask that you want to make, and try not to make it be small. The bigger and more important, if you have a Fortune 500 CEO in North Carolina that you can encourage to be part of something, make sure that you make it big and that you solicit their championship, and understand that you probably won't be able to control those guys because they've never been controlled by anybody.
So, Doug, I love you as well, and I agree with your second to last point. My only thing is that we have to remember that these people are CEOs, and they have busy, important lives, and so I think it's great to think big, but you're only going to get oftentimes one bite at the apple, and I think that's the reason for it to be an important ask. I'm not saying it shouldn't be important, but it better be something that they can get their arms around and do and complete, or you're going to lose them. That's my only point.
All right, well, good. I think that's exactly the kind of conversation we were hoping to have here. All right, so Doug, I'm going to actually ask you, and Mike actually too, but to react to something, because I put it on the table, and I think you disagree with me, and I think it would be great to hear your comments. So, part of what we have highlighted today are the private sector investments that have been made. And I know you have made the comment that parents and the public sector are really going to be the ones that are the major funders, and it's not going to be the private sector. But you also mentioned, the $30 million you raised to get Qualistar off the ground, and now it's swept the country in terms of quality rating systems. And then we see things like the Children's Corridor, where there's the real investment in funds to make something very important happen in Colorado. So my question really is around the potential for the private sector to leverage public funding. So for example, if legislators came to the private business leaders in their states and said, we'd like to partner with you to improve outcomes for kids. We've got some small amount of funding. We'd like you to come in with some amount of funding as well. What do you think the response would be from the private sector?
Well, I want to make sure I also answer Patsy Pierce's question. But I think that what my point is it's the law of big numbers. That Bill Gates has, roughly speaking, a net worth of $100 billion, I think. If Bill Gates gave every nickel over to the country, he would pay about 10 days of the deficit spending. So you have to go back to the size. If you understand child care as the piece you're doing, child care in America is bigger than entertainment. Child care as an industry is bigger than television and the movies. So you have to be circumspect on what the private investment is designed to accomplish. And if you're saying, hey, I'm going to improve the lives of a kid, it's great. The EduCare system that the Buffett Foundation did, I think it's great, but it exacerbates this idea that you win the lottery. That if I, as a child, can go to a setting that is really well funded by Warren Buffett's daughter, I'll be more successful, and that is true. I think that Stephanie, was that Stephanie or Julie who asked the question?
It's Stephanie.
Stephanie. I think the point I'm trying to make is that Sarah or Patsy, Senator James or Representative Myra, they're legislators. And so their responsibility, and who you're training here, their responsibility is to consider how public policy is going to impact the long-term life success of children. And so you have to be strategic in the way you solicit private investment. It should be designed to pilot a particular program that, if successful, can be brought to scale. And Qualistar remains a private, non-for-profit organization. It's not as big as I would hope it would have been when we formed it. That is the key accountability feature for the Denver Preschool Program, and it's paid for that and many things throughout the state. But it hasn't been funded to the point where it scales statewide and every setting can get the benefit of the rating. It's still at about a 35% market share of center-based care. So if I were a legislator and I said, well, I want to benefit the most kids, I have a successful program. I'm going to design a pilot that, if successful, the rest of the legislature will adopt this for the state as a whole. And it goes back to the question that Patsy asked, how do you counter complaints about early childhood investment increasing state and federal budgetary deficits? My answer is, we know for a fact. A Nobel Prize winning economist has told us, if we invest properly in this space, and this is where private investment can teach you how to invest privately in this space, that the long-term deficit not only does not go up, it declines. We know that. So we understand the implications of an investment, or it's not an investment, it's an expense. We have an accountability system that was privately developed that is available to be brought to scale, that makes predictable what we would ask. I wouldn't ask Sarah to ask her legislator or Patsy to ask the legislator in her state to make a blind choice. I think that's where business has discipline about numbers. So that's a long way of answering a short question.
No, that was terrific. Mike, did you have any thoughts about that?
I agree with Doug mainly, but I do, listen, I think that, the CED report asks companies to contribute, as I mentioned, 1% of corporate earnings to public-private partnerships. I think there are examples out there that we can experiment with. I've done a lot of work in Mississippi, and in Mississippi, the state funds $3 million annually for early care and education. $3 million. And, the business community stood up and said, you know what, if there's not a public will, if there's not a political will for this, we're gonna do something. And so I don't think we should underestimate, in some cases, businesses' interest in helping fund some of these things. But I largely agree with Doug. It's not something that we can certainly count on.
That's good. Thanks. That's really helpful. Julie's going to ask the next question that's come in on the computer.
Yeah. So in our chat box, we have a question from Sarah Archibald. Thanks to both of you for your very helpful comments. Can either of you comment on the following policies to help increase investment in early childhood from outside the traditional federal sources? One we've heard about is a one-to-one tax break for businesses if they donate to child care settings. The other is an idea about which we were approached, which they called social impact bonds, playing off the idea that making a small investment now will pay great dividends later. And she adds, the bonds would be purchased by private investors and foundations. A target would be set. If that target was achieved, the government would make success payments to the investor. Doug, would you like to comment?
Yeah, but I also want to make sure I get to answer Pam Myra's question.
Yeah, we're going to try to get to them all.
Yep.
So the quick comment that I would make is that we do have a tax credit in Colorado. Sarah, I don't understand the one-to-one relationship because, of course, you get a dollar credit. Well, you do get a dollar credit against the dollar tax in Colorado to invest in kids. That went away. During the current budget crisis. We basically cut all the higher ed funding in Colorado, and that was one of the things that we lost. It will come back. but I used to give $10,000 a year to Qualistar, and I would get that right off the top of my taxes. And so it was a voluntary contribution that basically cost me about 10 or 15 cents on the dollar to make. I think that's really compels you to do it in an underfunded arena like that. It's a good way to do that. And we didn't have enough use of it, but it's a wise choice. I wish I were a fan of social impact bonds, but I am not. I think that I dealt with this with Susan Blank at the the Women's Law Center in D.C., and I think in the long run what happens is that there is simply no ability to create an underwriting stream. I was a banker for a long time. I, as a banker, don't believe we have sufficient infrastructure in place today, sufficient accountability in place today, adequate measurement in place today that would allow you to really use a social impact bond for its intended purposes. So it's not something that I see yet as scalable unless you had solved all of the vexing problems of governance, accountability measurement, and outcome measurement.
If I could just add to that, CED helped in Louisiana where they had a tax credit. I think was fairly successful. I think it generated some $5 million for their early learning system. We put together a forum because business knew nothing about it. And I think that's one of the dangers of these programs is that there has to be education and information that gets out there. So I think it's important to experiment with these things, but I think it's just as important that a PR campaign be tied to it, because in the case of Louisiana, business leaders didn't know anything about what was going on.
That's great, thanks. I think, Doug, you wanted to answer one of the other questions, which is could you comment on the goal of having all children kindergarten ready and how that acknowledges the developmental differences between boys and girls?
I think that is such a smart question. Let me start with that. The public policy has unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences of the 1989 standards movement was we started to high-stake test children earlier. I think it's laudable that we do that, but it was done in a way that didn't acknowledge biology. So what occurs is you have a boy in third grade who's about a year and a half behind the girl in some components of social and executive skill development. And that creates a sense of failure, and I think it's contributed. It's no mistake that today 60% of college seats are now held by women, 40% by boys, because boys' perspective on how well they're going to do in school is already being shaped at the earliest phases. So I don't think this is necessarily an early childhood issue in the classic sense, but I think that if I'm understanding Representative Myra's question appropriately, you have to have an acknowledgement of just the biological expectation of somebody. Children develop in ranges. If you look at the Froebel concept in the British primary school movement, they're using multiple age groups because that acknowledges that the trajectories are different. And I think that we have to reform our system fairly swiftly to acknowledge those biological developmental differences and to give a more warm and welcoming perspective. It goes beyond just the social development, also goes to the kinetic and other elements of that. I'm on the board. I was recently the chairman of a university board, and we've talked a lot in our Department of Education about that disparity in terms of both development and in terms of learning style and perception. And we have got to go away from a one-size-fits-all prescription to one that's much more customized. And the hope that I have for technology is that technology and digital learning experiences that we now have on our sites at PBS could be used to better purposes, and the role of the teacher would shift in the classroom to me guiding the experience as opposed to homogenizing the experience.
So we have another question here in our chat box I'm going to ask. This is Julie. It's a good one. How do your organizations handle the argument about increased regulation and requirements versus the need for high-quality care? So that's the first half. And then why don't we start with that?
Mike, let me ask you to start.
Yeah, can you repeat that? I don't have the questions in front of me, so I'm having a difficult time here. What's the answer to the question?
We just want to know how your organization has handled the arguments about increased regulations and requirements versus the need for quality improvement, particularly for child care providers.
Yeah, I don't think we've really gotten to that level of detail in our report.
Okay, I can deal with that. That's a Qualistar question.
Yeah.
Would you let me know where Mimi Aledo Sandoval is?
Oh yeah, she's from Mexico.
And are you a policy advisor? Are you a representative?
Yeah. She's an analyst with the Legislative Finance Committee.
Perfect. Okay. So Mimi, I think this is where I would come across. I'm going to refer to my priest. 6 years ago, my priest came to us, and using the tax credit, we were able to make a donation to allow, not we, but the congregation was able to make a contribution to the church in order to have their child care setting rated. And so I get a call about a month later after they've rated, and he is mad as a hatter. You don't want to have an Irish priest mad at you. But he was mad because it wasn't, the rating system had given him an outcome that he didn't like, and the kids had to wash their hands too much. Well, even though it was private, it was still regulated. And so when we sat down with the director, the priest, a couple of us, Qualistar, we were able to give him a template for how to improve what we needed to do. And as a result, he was able to embrace what we had. Generally speaking, it's the rationality of the rating system, the rationality of the regulation that moves forward. As you know, I'm subject to FCC regulation. When I was a banker at the FDIC, and sometimes they just make no sense. To me, a lot of the hand cleaning that's in the ECRs and ITRs, which is part of most rating systems, is just too overdone. And so I think there is a fine balance. But the one comment I make about the regulation versus the quality improvement is that the anxiety level of almost every teacher is high when you start. If you can demonstrate to them that what you're doing will allow them to provide better service to children, they will embrace it. And in my career, this idea that I had to understand virtuous workforces, because in banking we worked for the money and people were moral, but it was very different than working in a virtuous workplace where mission drives everything, which it does here at PBS and it did in childcare. So you have to make sure that you're structured and align any system that you have and articulate it in a way that leads to outcomes for kids that are demonstrable. And I think once you do that, you're good. But too many, sort of bureaucratic, in bureaucratic execution. Why do we do that? Well, that's the way it is. If you have a great explanation, easier to do now that you have websites and other things, then I think you can be a partner with the system, with the setting that you're regulating, as opposed to a regulator in a harsh sense.
So to follow up on that, what advice would you give when talking to the child care industry about the quality improvements and how important it is?
I think the issue is to make sure that the regulatory scheme, and in our case, we knew there was no regulation in child care other than rudimentary licensing. So if I'm Mimi and I'm thinking, and I'm doing analytical work for the state legislature, I'm trying to think about, well, how do I create a system that is outcome oriented? And when I'm talking to the provider community, now Qualistar, we spent, and Stephanie and Julie were close to the Qualistar evolution, and we're good voices. You guys should all know that. But we spent 10,000 hours with the community in process, learning what was important, what could work. We had the child care community involved. And so part of what we did, and it's a gender-based comment, that I'm going to be careful about. But I grew to understand that process mattered. I always thought outcome mattered, but when you're evolving a regulatory scheme, process matters, and so having process patience to walk through new and emerging changes with, at a minimum, the leadership of the community, at a maximum, as many people as you can get in convening settings, you're going to have a lot more buy-in to what you're going to do. But I would encourage you, Mimi, to go to the qualistar.org site, qualistar.org, look at the rating system, and that starts to tell you how we rationalize each decision that was made in the rating system. And by the way, I'm no longer on that board. I've been gone for about 10 years. But if you look at Qualistar, it's got a really good articulation of what each of those sort of schematic pieces of the rating system are meant and designed to accomplish for kids. I hope that answered that. I feel like I'm struggling to get a concise answer.
No, I think that's really helpful, Doug. You know, I think part of where Mimi's question comes from is, and what we've seen as NCSL around quality rating systems across the country, is that they are not simple. They're multi-level, within each level, you know, multiple components. And I think it's, you know, for some legislators and for sometimes even the private child care providers, it's very hard for them to get their arms around what it all is and why it's all important. So I think from our end, we see some need to simplify the QRSs so that they are easier to understand and easier to comply with.
Stephanie, let me, that's a great comment for a legislator to tackle, or an analyst at the state level who's got regulatory responsibility.
Absolutely.
I completely agree with you. 80% of the benefit of any rating system is 20% of the key point. So that 80-20 rule applies in child care more than anywhere else, because the cost of doing everything is so high. When we did the work with RAND, the benefits of viewpoints, for example, I'll give you an example, but we couldn't get away with it. I think this is a policy. There are 42 at the time. I haven't studied new ECRs or new ITRs.
Right.
But at the time, there were 42 data points in ECRs. We spent $3 million on our evaluation with the RAND Corporation. What they said to us was that any randomly selected 6 data points adequately captured the quality level that you sought.
Mm-hmm.
So 1/7 of the data points were able to get you to a quality point that was equal. Now, from a diagnostic standpoint, they weren't as good. So instead of having 42 data points, you had 6. But if you look at the ratings level, we have 5 components, 4 of which are statistically reliable. And I think accreditation matters today. It didn't 10, 15 years ago because they were so bad. And I think if I'm a legislator, I'm inclined to continue to put pressure on the advocacy community to simplify, simplify, simplify. I think you guys should, the 4 or 5 of you who are in the children's section at NCSL, I think that idea of simplification is a critical thing, a critical asset that you're bringing to the conversation. And that what happens is that the educators, PhDs, and I know Stephanie's a lawyer, but I think Julie's a PhD. It's just, you went to school, you have so much education, you want so much of what you have to be in it, and here I am, just a state school guy, and I realized that was the benefit I brought with simplification. The rating systems do continue to get complicated because every time you redo them, somebody is going to rewrite her doctoral thesis from the bank school, and you've got to resist that temptation.
That's really helpful, because I appreciate you having been at the forefront of the quality rating work and then to reflect on it now. Thanks. I wanted to check in with Omar and just see if there's anyone on the phone that's waiting to ask a question, and if not, I have one for Mike.
The floor is now open for questions. On the phone, if you do have questions, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Questions will be taken in the order they were received. If you are using a speakerphone, we ask that while posing your question, you pick up your handset to provide favorable sound quality. If at any time your question has been answered, you can remove yourself from the queue by pressing 1. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have questions or comments, please press *1 on your telephone keypad.
Thanks for the instructions. Do we have anyone waiting in line yet?
At this point, we have no questions, ma'am.
Okay, that's fine. I'll give people a second to do that. In the meantime, I'm going to ask Mike a question, and maybe switch the conversation just a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about the recommendation to invest 1% of profits in public-private partnerships? I was wondering sort of how that recommendation. I know you commented that there's an interest in putting some financial commitment behind some of the recommendations, but I was curious how that recommendation came about and what sort of impact business is hoping to achieve with that, and if it's sort of more locally visioned or state visioned or nationally visioned.
Well, this report was formulated during, the worst economic time in our lifetime. And I think that the members of the committee felt that if they were going to ask legislators to not only hold steady investments in young children, but increase them, which would take enormous political will, that the business community had to respond themselves. And that they, as I said earlier, had to have skin in the game. So I think from that standpoint, it was, and I think the reason why it's a glimmer of hope for public-private partnerships, I think it was, it was an effort for them to say, we recognize that these are extraordinary times. This is not like it was 10 years ago. In order to keep these programs at the level that we need to have them and have them grow, we're going to need to rely on maybe other forms of resources.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. And are you all expecting those to be corporate investments, that might be more targeted locally, or had people not gotten to that level?
No, we didn't get to that level. But what happens is it really depends on the company. What we find is a company that is engaged, a bank that might be even present in 5 states, that's where their investment's going to be. A company that's invested, that has a presence in a smaller community, that's where their investment's going to be. So clearly, it's going to be where the company is located, and I think, depending on the size of the company, that's where the action's going to be.
Great, thank you. And I had one other question as a follow-up for you, Doug, around the Children's Corridor. It seems to me that the Children's Corridor is just a very concentrated effort in a particular geographic area to really make something happen, and it looks like a pretty significant investment. I don't know how much money's been put into that in Colorado, but it makes me that sort of suggests to me again an opportunity for a legislature to say, we'd like to see what comes out of that, and then think about how you might go to scale with something similar. Do you see that as part of the goal of the Children's Corridor?
As you know, I'm not intimately involved with that. But yeah, I think that what they want to demonstrate is that an intense organization of existing resources can build a foundation for change. I think one of the dilemmas that you face by having such an intense, geographically oriented project is that it doesn't seem to be generalizable over time, and I think that is one of their goals. I would make a comment on strategy. I think if you can prove that something would work in the worst possible demographic environment, socioeconomic environment, it's pretty safe to say it could be successful in other environments. One of the things we've worked consciously about in early childhood is to make sure that we made it universal. The Denver preschool program, for example, had a sliding scale so that a family of some affluence might get just a nominal contribution to them, $10, whereas another family might get $1,500. But the idea was that we wanted the optics to look as if it were everybody. When we think about social policy schemes, the 3 most successful social interventions in the history of America are all universal: public schools, Medicare, and Social Security. Those entitlements are popular because everybody benefits. When you start thinking about schemes for early childhood, even though you understand that you can't fund all of them, that sliding scale may give you the best opportunity to have impact, I would encourage each of you as an analyst or as a legislator to think about how you make this look universal so that a black face, a brown face, a poor face is not the only thing that is seen by somebody who needs to make a decision, but the face of their own child is there, and that's important. So that to me is a strategy that has to be deployed if at all possible. And I think Terry's trying to figure out how they make what they're doing generalizable over time.
That's great. That's really helpful, and I would imagine we could have a whole conversation about the universal versus targeted, sort of strategies and how states might think about that. So I'm really glad you raised that.
And Stephanie, I think it's essential to even when we know it's targeted, to try to create an illusion that it's universal.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I agree. This is Mike, and politically, it's very helpful as well. And if the legislators on the phone, they know that when they can go back to constituents and they talk about this as a universal plan or program, it has a lot more resonance politically.
That's great. So I'm going to we actually are reaching our time where we're going to, I think, wrap up the conversation, but I want to see if there is anyone else on the phone that has a question. And if not, I will make a couple wrap-up comments. Omar, is there anyone waiting in the queue on the phone?
At this point, we have no more questions at this time.
Good. Okay, perfect. That leaves us in perfect timing. So I actually just want to take a second to thank our speakers, Mike Pedro and Doug Price. This was a very lively and interesting conversation, and I think we were writing down some real nuggets that have come out of this, and I hope that all of you on the phone and all of you on the webinar itself really got a lot out of this. I know that we sure did, and we're going to be able to post this on our website for additional people to listen in on. So I'm going to turn it back over to Julie. Actually, I want to make one more comment before I pass it over to Julie, which is, this is a topic that NCSL is interested in exploring, and Mike Pedro and I from CED have started a conversation about how do we think about these ideas around partnering between legislatures and the business sector. And so we're going to be continuing to explore that, we hope, over the next year. And if any of you are interested in furthering this conversation or being someone we might call on for your input, please let Julie Poppy know, and we'll get back in touch with you as this sort of work continues. So Julie, I'll pass it back on to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again to Mike Pedro and Doug Price for their presentations and the rich discussion. This has been great. So I just need to go through a few things before we end the call, and that is, as Steph mentioned, all the resources from today's webinar are going to be on the website. The archived version of this webinar, any of the publications that were brought up during the conversation today will be on the website, ncsl.org/fellows. So please go there and see what you can find. We're going to be sending out a webinar survey shortly. We value your feedback, so please send in your evaluation regarding today's webinar call. Another thing is that our final Fellows newsletter will be coming out at the end of the month. So let us know if you have anything that you want us to highlight or talk about in the newsletter. We'd love to hear from you. And finally, the work of this Fellows group is ending, and we will be sending out an overall evaluation of the Fellows program. And we'd like you to take some time to fill it out and give us your thoughts. And that will be coming to you probably at the end of August, beginning of September. We take your suggestions and we put them into motion, especially for the Fellows program for next year. So please just fill out that evaluation. We're also exploring the alumni role for current Fellows for next year's Fellows program. So let me know. Julie Poppy or Allison may know if you're interested in staying involved with the Fellows program. We'd love to have you be a part of it. So with that, I'm going to end the webinar. On behalf of the staff, Stephanie, Julie, Allison, and Toulon here at NCSL, we want to thank you for a successful first year's Fellows Program. And again, thanking the presenters. It's a wonderful, wonderful webinar. And I just want to say have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye.